In 1840, beneath the humid skies of New Orleans, a young woman was placed on an auction block, and the room went silent, not because she was defiant, not because she was broken, but because every man in that room sensed something impossible about her. She was labeled property, yet she carried herself like someone who knew a secret no one else did, a secret so dangerous it would turn her into the most coveted female slave ever auctioned in the city, and erase her from history just as quickly. This is a story buried on purpose, and once you hear it, you'll understand why. Welcome to Born into Darkness. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end, because stories like this were not buried by accident, and once you hear it all, you'll understand why history tried so hard to forget her. And when this part ends, leave a comment telling us just how deep this story pulled you in. New Orleans, 1840, a city breathing through heat, rot, perfume, and fear. The Mississippi River pulsed like a dark vein through its heart, carrying sugar, cotton, gold, and human lives. Every dock, every brick street, every candlelit hall knew the sound of chains. Slavery was not hidden here. It was displayed openly, proudly, as commerce. People were not bought in shadows. They were sold beneath chandeliers, with polished floors and printed catalogues, their value spoken aloud like livestock. On Royal Street stood one of the most notorious auction houses in the South. Its walls had heard prayers whispered in terror and laughter soaked in cruelty. Men arrived dressed in linen and confidence, already calculating profit before the hammer ever fell. They came expecting routine, another woman, another body, another transaction to be forgotten by dinner. But this day did not follow routine. The woman was brought in just after midday, when the air inside the auction house had grown thick enough to choke on. She was not announced with flourish, no exaggerated description of her hips, her teeth, or her childbearing years. The clerk hesitated before reading her listing, as if the paper itself resisted being spoken. Her name was recorded simply as Eliza. No birthplace, no plantation history, no owner listed prior to the auction. Just one unsettling phrase written in careful ink, origin uncertain. That alone was enough to make seasoned buyers uneasy. Slaves always had origins. They were tracked, categorized, branded by paperwork as much as by iron. Uncertainty meant trouble, legal disputes, hidden bloodlines, questions that could reach places powerful men preferred to keep sealed. A woman without a traceable past was not just property, she was a risk. When Eliza stepped onto the auction block, the room changed. She did not stumble. She did not cling to the escort who led her forward. Her wrists bore marks of restraint, but her posture did not bow to them. She stood upright, shoulders back, chin lifted, not defiant, not submissive, but something far more unsettling, composed. Her eyes did not dart around the room like prey searching for escape. Instead, she studied the crowd slowly, deliberately, as though she were memorizing faces for a reason none of them could understand. Men who had purchased hundreds of human beings before found themselves looking away. There was nothing exaggerated about her appearance. She was not dressed to entice, no forced smile, no practiced tears. Yet attention gathered around her like gravity. The auctioneer cleared his throat once, then again. The silence stretched longer than etiquette allowed, and still no one spoke. In New Orleans, silence was rare, especially in rooms built for buying flesh. Eliza's skin bore no obvious scars from field labor. Her hands were steady, fingers long, nails clean. Her breathing was slow, too slow. People noticed that first. Fear usually revealed itself in the chest. Hers did not. A plantation owner near the front reportedly muttered that she looked like someone waiting for an appointment, not a sentence. The auctioneer finally began his pitch, stumbling through generic phrases that did not quite fit. He spoke of her age, estimated, not known, her health, satisfactory, her temperament, untested. The words felt thin in the air, like excuses rather than facts. Each sentence raised more questions than it answered, and then Eliza spoke. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was a correction. The auctioneer mispronounced a French word he didn't realize he'd used. She corrected him gently, calmly. In perfect French, a ripple passed through the room. Some laughed, assuming it was mimicry, a trick learned to impress buyers. But then she continued speaking, not just French, but structured, educated French, the kind learned from books, not overheard in kitchens. She stopped herself quickly, as if remembering where she was, and returned to silence. The damage was already done. Eyes narrowed. Calculations shifted. Interest deepened into something sharper. How does a woman enslaved in the American South know the language of European salons? How does she recognize pronunciation errors? How does she possess the confidence to correct a white man in public without flinching? No answer sat comfortably. A buyer near the back whispered that she reminded him of a tutor he once hired in Paris. Another swore under his breath that she had looked directly at him and smiled, not pleading but knowing, the kind of smile that suggested she understood something about him that he had never confessed aloud. By the time bidding was announced, word had already begun spreading beyond the auction house walls. Dock workers whispered to tavern owners. Clerks leaned out of windows to catch a glimpse. Something unusual was happening, and New Orleans thrived on the scent of anomaly. The first bid was modest, almost cautious. Then Eliza raised her eyes. It was a small movement, barely noticeable. But those who saw it later described the same sensation, as if the temperature shifted, as if the room tilted, just slightly, off its axis. Her gaze settled on the bidder, and for a moment the man hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. He did not raise his offer again. Others stepped in quickly, eager not to appear shaken. Prices climbed higher than expected, too high for a woman with no verified skills listed, too high for someone whose past could not be neatly catalogued, and yet no one backed away. Something about her promised value that could not be written on paper. As the bidding continued, observers began noticing details that did not fit. Eliza reacted before statements were made, as if anticipating words. When a man shifted his weight to signal a higher offer, she glanced at him first. When someone scoffed quietly, she turned her head before the sound fully formed. It unsettled those who noticed. It frightened the ones who understood what it implied. Awareness like that did not come from obedience. It came from listening, watching, learning. In a society built on the idea that enslaved people were incapable of intellect beyond labor, Eliza stood as a living contradiction, not shouting rebellion, not begging for mercy, simply existing in a way that made the lie visible, and lies do not like to be seen. By the end of that first hour, the auction house was packed beyond capacity. Men who had never attended a slave auction before squeezed against walls, drawn by rumors they could not explain. Even women peered from balconies, curiosity overpowering propriety. No one wanted to miss whatever this was becoming, because it was no longer just an auction. It was a moment. And moments like this, moments where power senses a crack in its own illusion, are dangerous. Eliza remained still through it all, not because she was resigned, but because she was waiting for something to happen that she already knew was coming. And as the hammer prepared to fall, as prices rose into territory that made even seasoned traders uneasy, one truth became unavoidable to everyone in that room. This woman had not been born into darkness the way they expected. She had walked into it, and whatever secret she carried had already begun to bend the room around her. The hammer did not fall that day as cleanly as it should have. It hovered in the auctioneer's hand, suspended by a tension no ledger could account for. The bids had climbed past reason, past precedent, into a realm where even the wealthiest men began to feel the heat of exposure. This was not how these transactions usually ended. A price was named, a life was transferred, and the room exhaled. But the air refused to move. It clung to Eliza like a held breath. When the auctioneer finally brought the hammer down, the sound echoed longer than expected, as if the walls themselves hesitated to accept the outcome. A buyer had won, at least on paper. But nothing about the moment felt settled. Eyes remained fixed on the woman at the center of it all, as if everyone sensed that the true exchange had not yet occurred. Ownership, after all, required more than payment. It required submission, and Eliza had offered none. She was led from the block, not dragged, not rushed. The escort's grip on her arm was firm but uncertain, like a man unsure whether the thing he held could turn and bite. As she passed through the crowd, whispers followed her, overlapping and contradictory. Some called her lucky, others called her cursed. A few used a word they barely dared to say aloud, dangerous. Outside, the city pressed in close. New Orleans did that, wrapped itself around you, sticky and loud and alive. The streets were thick with carts and calls and the smell of river mud. Yet even here, even amid the chaos, people noticed her. Heads turned, conversations faltered. A woman leaned out of a window and crossed herself without knowing why. Eliza did not look back at the auction house. She did not look down. She did not look afraid. She looked observant. Her buyer, whose name would soon become a ghost in the records, walked several steps behind her. That distance was unusual. Most buyers stayed close, eager to assert possession immediately. He did not. Whether from caution or instinct, he allowed space between them, as if proximity carried a risk he could not quite define. They moved through streets that changed names every few blocks, past iron balconies and shuttered windows, toward a carriage waiting where the road widened. As Eliza stepped inside, she paused for a fraction of a second and touched the wooden frame of the door. It was not a gesture of comfort, it was one of recognition, wood, grain, age. As if she were reading it, the buyer noticed. That night, the rumors multiplied. In taverns along the river, men spoke of the price she fetched and shook their heads. In parlors, women speculated about her education, her beauty, her audacity. In kitchens and quarters, enslaved people whispered more carefully. They spoke of her eyes, of how she watched without flinching, of how she seemed to know when someone was lying. These whispers did not carry hope exactly, but they carried attention. And attention in a system built on silence was a form of power. By morning, stories had already begun to drift away from the truth. Some said she was the illegitimate daughter of a French aristocrat, smuggled across the ocean and hidden in plain sight. Others claimed she had once belonged to a convent and learned her letters from nuns before being sold. A darker rumor suggested she had been raised in a household where secrets were currency, and that she had learned to collect them the way other children collected toys. What united all the stories was the same unsettled conclusion. Eliza was not supposed to be where she was. Her new residence, if it could be called that, was not a plantation. It was a townhouse near the edge of the French Quarter, respectable enough to avoid scrutiny, discreet enough to invite none. She was not sent to the fields. She was not assigned to the kitchen. She was given a small room on the second floor, with a narrow window that overlooked the street. That alone raised questions. The first night she was not ordered to do anything. No instructions, no threats, no explanation. Food was brought to her room, simple, clean, carefully prepared. She ate slowly, methodically, tasting as if each bite confirmed something she already suspected. When she finished, she placed the plate precisely where it would be found and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. She listened to the building settle, to footsteps below, to voices that lowered when they spoke her name. She listened for patterns. In the days that followed, her buyer tested her without realizing it. He asked questions disguised as commands. He made statements meant to provoke fear. He observed her reactions the way men in his position had been taught to observe livestock. But Eliza did not react the way livestock did. She responded with precision. She followed instructions exactly, but never more than required. She spoke when spoken to, but her answers were careful, balanced, as if weighed before release, and sometimes, too rarely to be dismissed as accident, she answered questions that had not yet been asked. Once he began to speak about a business matter, stopped himself and waved her away. She turned to leave, then paused. "You should sell before the river turns," she said quietly. He stared at her, unsure he had heard correctly. "What did you say?" She did not repeat herself. A week later, a shipment was lost when the river flooded earlier than predicted. Another time, she corrected a sum he had miscalculated, saving him money he did not realize he was about to lose. She did so without arrogance, without apology, just a statement of fact, delivered as if the error had always been obvious. Her value, it seemed, was not physical, it was cognitive, strategic, and that made her difficult to place. In New Orleans, there were categories for enslaved people: field hands, house servants, craftsmen. Each role justified a price, a function, a rationale that allowed buyers to sleep at night. Eliza did not fit any of them. She was not trained for labor, yet she was clearly trained for something. She knew how to hold a pen correctly, though she claimed she had never written. She recognized books by touch alone, running her fingers along spines as if recalling them from memory. When asked where she learned these things, she said only from listening. Listening to whom was never answered. The buyer began inviting guests, not openly, not formally, just one or two men at a time, always powerful, always discreet. They spoke in the front room over drinks, while Eliza was asked to stand nearby, silent. At first, she was meant to be decoration, a display of ownership, a curiosity to be admired. But the conversations shifted when she was present. They slowed, they became careful, as if her silence itself was a witness. On more than one occasion, A guest would glance at her mid-sentence and lose his place. Another would lower his voice instinctively. One man, drunk enough to forget himself, laughed and asked her what she thought of the discussion. Eliza met his gaze. "I think you already know the answer," she said. He did not laugh again. Word spread quietly among a certain class of men that there was a woman in the quarter who could hear what was not said, who noticed what was avoided, who made rooms uncomfortable simply by standing in them. Some dismissed it as superstition, others were less sure. Those men did not return. Still, she was never beaten, never punished. That absence, too, was noticed. Violence was the language of control, and its absence suggested something had gone wrong with the grammar. The buyer seemed to fear that force would break something he could not afford to lose. Eliza, for her part, continued to observe. She learned the rhythms of the house, the habits of the staff, the schedules of the street outside. She learned when deliveries arrived and when doors were left unlocked. She learned which men lied poorly and which lied too well. She learned which names caused pauses in conversation, which places were never mentioned twice, and she stored all of it away. At night, when the city quieted into a low hum, she sat by the window and watched the lamps flicker along the street. She did not dream of escape in the way others did. There were no frantic plans, no desperate rehearsals. Her mind moved differently. It catalogued, it waited, it prepared. Because Eliza understood something that most people trapped in systems of power did not. Survival was not always about movement. Sometimes it was about stillness, about letting others reveal themselves fully before deciding what to do with the knowledge. That understanding unnerved those around her more than any act of rebellion could have. Soon letters began arriving for her buyer, sealed, marked urgent, written in hands that suggested education and influence. Eliza did not read them. She did not need to. She knew when one contained bad news by the way it was opened. She knew when one carried opportunity by the way it was folded afterward. She commented on neither unless asked. But when she was asked, her answers were exact. The price paid for her at auction no longer seemed excessive. It seemed inevitable, because by then it was clear to those paying attention that Eliza was not a possession to be used. She was a variable to be managed, a mind operating just beyond the reach of the rules meant to contain it. And in a city built on rigid hierarchies, nothing was more destabilizing than something that could not be neatly placed. The girl no one could price had become the woman no one could fully own, and somewhere beneath the layers of rumor and observation and unspoken fear, a question began to form, one that would grow more dangerous with every passing day. If Eliza had learned all of this simply by listening, what else did she know? By the time the question began to circulate, what else did she know? It was already too late to contain it. Questions have a way of moving faster than answers, especially in a city like New Orleans, where information slid through cracks the way water did, seeping under doors, traveling along walls, carried by people who did not realize they were messengers. Eliza did not need to leave the townhouse for her presence to spread. The city learned her shape by rumor first, and rumor, once given a body, becomes difficult to kill. It started quietly, always did. A clerk at the docks mentioned a woman who could predict market shifts without touching a ledger. A riverboat captain joked, half serious, half drunk, that a quiet girl in the quarter had warned him not to sail on a certain tide. He hadn't listened. He'd lost cargo, time, and reputation. He laughed as he told the story, but his eyes did not. Laughter in New Orleans was often just a cover for fear that hadn't decided what it was yet. The whispers took on texture. They sharpened. They learned how to choose their audience. Among enslaved people, her name was spoken softly and rarely, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt fragile. Stories about Eliza did not sound like promises. They sounded like puzzles. She was said to see through lies without raising her voice, to notice things overseers missed, to understand the difference between obedience and submission. Some said she had once told a woman exactly how long her child would live, not cruelly, not dramatically, just as a fact. When the child died on the day Eliza had named, the woman stopped speaking her name altogether. Among free black communities, the rumors were more careful, threaded with caution and disbelief. Knowledge was dangerous. Being seen as exceptional was dangerous. But and here, Even among those who had learned to survive by keeping their heads down, curiosity bloomed. How could someone exist so openly wrong for the system and still be breathing? What protection did she have? Or was she simply not afraid of the cost? White society, predictably, reacted in fragments. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration, the product of boredom and superstition. Others leaned in. Men who considered themselves rational began asking indirect questions. Had anyone actually tested her? Had she been proven wrong? Was she simply observant or something else? The need to categorize her, to file her away under something explainable, became urgent, because what could not be explained could not be controlled. Eliza herself seemed unaware of the stories, or, perhaps more accurately, uninterested. She continued her routines, small and deliberate. She listened. She spoke when spoken to. She watched people reveal themselves through impatience, vanity, carelessness. She did not interrupt. She did not warn unless asked. That restraint frustrated those who wanted her to be a spectacle. She refused to perform mystery. She simply existed within it. Her buyer noticed the change before anyone else. Not the rumors themselves, those reached him filtered and softened, but their effects. Men arrived more tense than before. Conversation stopped when she entered the room, then restarted in altered forms, as if words had been rearranged to hide their original intent. Deals that should have closed easily stalled. Decisions were postponed. People hesitated around her, not knowing whether to treat her as furniture or as a mirror. Once, a guest asked outright where she had learned to read faces so well. Eliza considered him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Most people tell you what they want," she said finally. "They just don't use words." The guest laughed too loudly. Later, he asked that she not be present again. Another man, older, sharper, less inclined to joke, requested a private conversation. The buyer refused, not angrily, not defensively, simply refused. That refusal traveled outward, too. It suggested boundaries where none were supposed to exist. It suggested that Eliza was not merely owned, she was being guarded. That implication drew attention from the wrong places. Soon the whispers took on a darker edge. It was no longer just that Eliza was perceptive. It was that she knew things she should not. Names were attached. Events. Someone claimed she had predicted a duel's outcome before either man had chosen weapons. Another insisted she had known about a pregnancy weeks before the woman herself admitted it. These stories contradicted one another in detail but aligned in tone. Eliza did not guess. She knew New Orleans was a city that tolerated magic as long as it stayed theatrical. Fortune-tellers in the market, charms sold in alleys, rituals framed as entertainment. But Eliza did not fit that mold. She did not advertise. She did not charge. She did not claim power. That made her far more unsettling than anyone who did. When people sought her out, it was never directly. Questions were routed through intermediaries. Requests were phrased as hypotheticals. If someone were considering an investment, if a family were concerned about an illness. Eliza listened, answered when she chose to, and remained silent when she did not. Her silence, more than her words, shaped the outcomes. People filled it with their own conclusions, and conclusions have consequences. A plantation owner cancelled a purchase after Eliza asked a single clarifying question. A merchant delayed a shipment and avoided ruin. A man accused of crimes he thought buried left the city abruptly after spending one evening in the townhouse, pale and shaken. He told no one what had been said. He did not need to. His fear did the speaking. Not everyone benefited. A woman once begged Eliza to tell her whether her husband would return from a journey up. Eliza listened, then shook her head. "Prepare yourself," she said. The woman screamed. She cursed her. She left in fury. When the husband's body was recovered weeks later, the woman refused to acknowledge Eliza again. Knowledge, when unwanted, curdles quickly into resentment. With each story, the whispers grew heavier. They gained weight, consequence. People began to speak her name with a pause before and after, as if bracketing it might contain its effects. Some stopped saying it altogether, referring to her only as that woman, as if anonymity could blunt impact. It did not. What truly frightened those in power was not that Eliza knew things. It was that she did not seem surprised by them. There was no thrill in her accuracy, no satisfaction in being right. She treated outcomes as if they had already happened somewhere else, and was simply arriving late. That calm suggested a worldview fundamentally incompatible with control, because control relies on uncertainty, on fear of the unknown. Eliza's presence reduced uncertainty in rooms built to thrive on it. She did not challenge authority directly. She did something worse. She made it visible. The buyer began receiving warnings, subtle at first, then less so. Friends advised discretion. Associates suggested distance. One man, drunk enough to be honest, told him that keeping her was a liability. "People are talking," he said. "They don't like things they can't measure." The buyer asked what exactly they were afraid of. The man shrugged. "That she's right," he said. Pressure mounted, invitations slowed, doors closed more quietly than before. The townhouse, once a place of discreet power, became a point of discomfort on the map of the city. People passed it and looked away, or looked too long. Both were signs of unease, and beneath it all another whisper began, one far more dangerous than the rest, that Eliza remembered things, not memories of her own past, those remained elusive, but memories of others. That she could recall conversations she should not have heard, that she could repeat phrases spoken months earlier, in different rooms, by different men who had never met, that she could connect details scattered across time and space and assemble them into something coherent. In a city where secrets were currency, that ability was unforgivable. Someone finally tried to test her. A man known for his skepticism arranged an encounter designed to expose her. He fed her false information through multiple channels, waited and watched. When Eliza repeated the lie back to him, exactly as given, he smiled, triumphant. Proof, he thought, that she was merely reflecting what she heard. Then she added a detail he had not planted, a name, a place, a consequence. The man's smile faded. He left early. He did not speak of the encounter again. Within a month he sold his interests and moved north. After that the whispers changed tone. They became urgent. People no longer asked whether Eliza was exceptional. They asked how long she could be allowed to remain so. Exceptionalism, in the logic of the time, was tolerable only when it served the system. Eliza did not serve it. She exposed its fragility simply by being uncontainable. The buyer understood this before the others did. He watched the city turn subtly, the way weather changes before a storm. He noticed how often her name appeared in conversations where it did not belong, how often decisions were justified by reference to her presence, her influence, her perceived reach. He began to realize that whatever he had purchased at auction was no longer just a woman, it was a focal point, and focal points attract force. Eliza sensed the shift as well. She did not react outwardly, she continued listening, but she adjusted her stillness, fine-tuning it, the way one might adjust balance on a narrow ledge. She spoke less. She watched more. She began to choose silence, not as default, but as strategy, because the whispers that followed her were no longer curious. They were preparing, and in New Orleans, when whispers stopped asking questions and started making plans, it meant that something, or someone, was about to disappear. The shift did not announce itself with violence. It arrived the way real danger often does, quietly, wrapped in civility, disguised as inevitability. New Orleans continued to move. Ships docked, bells rang, money changed hands, but beneath the surface the city had begun to lean away from Eliza, as if instinctively bracing for impact. When whispers become plans, the air itself grows careful. Conversations shorten. Decisions are made elsewhere, and the people at the center of attention are rarely invited to the room where those decisions take shape. Eliza sensed it before any words confirmed it, not because she was warned, but because patterns began to break. Visitors stopped arriving without explanation. Letters came less frequently than not at all. The buyer's routines changed. Meals skipped, nights restless, glances lingering too long on doors and windows. He did not speak to her about it. He did not need to. Fear has a sound. It tightens footsteps. It sharpens breathing. Eliza heard it everywhere. What she did not expect was the solution they chose. It came dressed as legality. A notice arrived one morning, sealed and official, citing a discrepancy in ownership records tied to her original sale. The phrasing was careful, neutral, almost apologetic. An error, it claimed, a misfiled document, nothing personal. But the implication was unmistakable. Eliza's presence had become inconvenient. An inconvenience, in a system built on paperwork, could always be reframed as a clerical issue. The buyer read the notice twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened. He folded the paper slowly, as if controlling the movement might control the outcome. Eliza watched from across the room. She did not ask what it said. "You're to be sold again," he finally said. Again, the word hung between them, heavy with repetition. As if the first auction had been a rehearsal, as if everything since had merely confirmed what the city had already decided, that whatever Eliza was, she could not remain where she was. The buyer attempted resistance, quiet inquiries, private meetings, appeals framed as concerns about precedent and profit. He argued that removing her now would draw more attention than leaving her alone, that she was valuable, that she could be managed. He was wrong about one thing: Eliza was valuable, but she could not be managed. The second auction was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. There was no public announcement, no printed notices posted in the usual places. Invitations were delivered by hand, selectively. Attendance would be limited, controlled. This was not meant to be spectacle. It was meant to be resolution. The irony was sharp. The very attempt to minimize attention ensured the opposite. Word leaked, as it always does. Not widely, but precisely. The kind of men who needed to know found out. And they came. The auction house was different this time. Smaller. Private. The walls were darker, the windows shuttered. There were no casual observers, no curious onlookers pressed against the back. Every man in the room had a reason for being there, and none of those reasons were simple. Eliza was brought in last. The moment she entered, conversation stopped, not out of surprise but recognition. This was not curiosity anymore, this was assessment. She could feel it, the way a change in pressure announces itself before a storm. She walked to the center of the room and stopped where she was told. Chains were present, but loosely applied, more symbolic than functional. The men noticed. So did she. She did not lower her eyes. The auctioneer was not the same man as before. This one was older, his voice steady with experience, his manner practiced in rooms where discretion mattered. He did not embellish, he did not perform, he read from the document as if it were a legal proceeding, not a sale. "Eliza," he said, and paused. Not for effect, for confirmation. As if saying the name itself required permission, he began listing her attributes. Educated, observant, linguistically capable, no mention of obedience, no mention of temperament. The omissions were louder than the words. The opening bid was already high. No one reacted. The auctioneer raised it himself, naming a number that would have been unthinkable for a woman with no recorded lineage. Still no response. The silence stretched. It was not hesitation. It was calculation. Everyone in the room was waiting to see who would move first, and what that movement would reveal. Eliza felt it then, the weight of being measured not as a person but as a risk. She understood auctions, not because she had been taught, but because systems repeat themselves. Power bids cautiously when uncertain, aggressively when confident. Here, confidence was absent. Everyone wanted her, but no one wanted to be seen wanting her too much. The first bid came from the side, quiet and deliberate. The number jumped sharply. A message, not an offer. Another followed immediately, higher. Faster, the auctioneer barely had time to speak. As the price rose, the tension shifted. This was no longer about acquisition, it was about containment. Whoever won would not simply own Eliza. They would assume responsibility for whatever consequences followed. That knowledge weighed on every raised hand. Eliza watched them all. She recognized some faces from the townhouse. Others were new. Some men looked at her with calculation, others with fear thinly veiled as disdain. One or two avoided her gaze entirely, bidding without ever looking up, as if eye contact might seal a contract they did not want to acknowledge. Halfway through the bidding, she spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough. "Whoever buys me," she said, "will lose everything." The room froze. It was not the content of the statement that unsettled them, it was the timing. She had waited until the momentum was undeniable, until the numbers had climbed beyond caution, until everyone present had already invested something in the outcome. Her voice cut across the process like a blade through silk. The auctioneer faltered. He glanced around, unsure whether to intervene. No one instructed him to stop. No one instructed him to continue. Some men laughed. Nervous laughter, brittle and quick. One scoffed openly, dismissing it as theatrics. Another muttered something about superstition. But hands lowered, bids slowed. The room recalculated. Eliza did not repeat herself. She did not explain. She simply met their eyes, one by one, offering no challenge, no defiance. Just certainty. And certainty is contagious. A buyer near the front withdrew entirely, shaking his head as if waking from a trance. Another hesitated, then lowered his hand mid-gesture, as though realizing too late that he had gone too far. The auctioneer attempted to regain control, calling out numbers more rapidly, but the rhythm had been broken. Except for one man, he had not bid yet. He sat near the back, partially obscured by shadow, his posture relaxed in a way that did not match the tension in the room. He had watched the entire process without visible reaction. When Eliza spoke, he did not flinch. When others hesitated, he leaned forward slightly, as if interest had only just begun. When he finally raised his hand, the number he named silenced the room completely. It was absurd, unprecedented. 3 times higher than the highest price ever recorded for a female slave in the city. The auctioneer stared at him, momentarily stunned. He repeated the number, as if confirming it might make it more reasonable. No one challenged it. Eliza looked at the man for the first time. Their eyes met, and she smiled. Not triumphantly, not mockingly, knowingly. The hammer fell. This time, the sound did not echo. It landed heavily, final, as if the building itself had accepted the decision and sealed it away. The auction was over. No applause, no conversation. Men began to leave immediately, avoiding one another's eyes, already distancing themselves from whatever they had narrowly avoided or narrowly missed. The buyer who had held her until now did not protest. He did not argue. Relief and regret crossed his face in equal measure. He signed the papers quickly, as if speed might spare him from reflection. When he handed over the final document, his hand shook. Eliza was led away once more. But this time, something was different. The man who had purchased her did not keep his distance. He walked beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence without looking. His grip on her arm was firm, confident. Not cruel, but not hesitant either. This was not fear. It was intent. As they exited the auction house through a side door, Eliza glanced back, not at the room, not at the men, but at the space where she had stood. The place where her value had been debated, her future decided by raised hands and spoken numbers. She did not look angry. She looked finished. Outside, the carriage waited. No crowd, no witnesses. The city moved on, unaware that something irreversible had just occurred within its walls. Eliza stepped inside without resistance. The door closed. The carriage pulled away. And with that movement, Eliza vanished from public record. No sale notices followed. No gossip lingered long enough to solidify. Her name appeared nowhere else, not in ledgers, not in court documents, not in letters that survived. It was as if the second auction had not just transferred ownership, but erased a person. But erasure is never complete. Because those who were in the room that day remembered something they could not file away or forget. The moment when a woman marked as property had warned them, calmly and without desperation, that proximity to her carried a cost. And the man who paid that cost willingly had done so with eyes open. Whatever he believed Eliza to be, whatever secret he thought she held, one thing was certain. The auction that changed everything did not end with the hammer. It only moved the story somewhere darker. The carriage did not take the main roads. It moved through narrower streets where lamps were spaced farther apart and shadows gathered more confidently, as if they belonged there. Eliza felt the change immediately, not fear but orientation. Cities announced their intentions through rhythm. The clatter of wheels softened. The noise of voices thinned. The air cooled just enough to suggest distance from the river. This was not a route chosen for speed. It was chosen for privacy. The man who had purchased her spoke only once. "You will not be seen," he said, as if stating a condition of weather rather than a rule. "That is the arrangement." Eliza nodded, not in agreement. In understanding, they arrived at a residence that did not announce itself. No gate, no sign, just a house that blended into the street, the way certain people blend into rooms, present but forgettable by design. Inside, the space was spare, carefully ordered, as if excess had been removed not for comfort but for clarity. Eliza was shown to a room with no view of the street. The window looked inward, onto a narrow courtyard where nothing grew. This, she realized, was the point. The man did not threaten her. He did not explain himself. He did not ask questions. He left her with instructions that were less about control than containment. Meals would arrive. Books would be provided if requested. Visitors would be rare. Silence would be expected. And then he was gone. Days passed. Then weeks. Eliza marked time not by calendars, none were given, but by patterns, footsteps, deliveries. The cadence of the household. She learned that the house had ears but not eyes, that people listened more than they watched, that information flowed inward, N-O-T outward. She did not test the boundaries. Not yet, because something else became clear very quickly. No one was looking for her. Not officially, not unofficially. There were no inquiries, no rumors that reached her ears, no anxious servants whispering about her fate. The city, which had once buzzed with her name, had gone silent. It was as if the second auction had not only removed her from circulation, but rewritten the memory of her existence. Eliza had been swallowed by bureaucracy. Ownership records ended abruptly. The buyer's name did not appear in subsequent filings. There were no transport logs, no tax declarations. The paper trail, the thing that made slavery legible to itself, had been cut cleanly, with intention. Someone had wanted Eliza not merely moved, but untraceable. This was not erasure born of neglect, it was erasure as strategy. The man who owned the house returned occasionally, never on a schedule she could predict. When he did not summon her immediately. He allowed time to pass, as if measuring her reaction to his presence. When they did speak, it was never about the past. He did not ask her where she came from, he did not ask her how she knew what she knew. He asked questions framed around futures that might or might not exist. If a man were to leave the city, he once said, what would he need to take with him? Eliza answered carefully, not with advice, but with conditions. He would need to know what follows him, she said, and what waits. He absorbed that without comment. Sometimes he brought letters, not for her to read, but for her to hear. He would read passages aloud, selectively, watching her face for reaction. Eliza gave him little. She had learned by now that her greatest leverage was not accuracy, but restraint. People reveal far more when they are unsure whether they are being seen clearly. Still, small things escaped her control. Once, as he read a letter describing unrest upriver, she closed her eyes briefly. Just a moment. He noticed. What is it, he asked. That will not end where they think it will, she said. He did not ask her to explain. Weeks later, the unrest turned into something else entirely. Despite the isolation, fragments of the outside world reached her, not as news but as residue. Tension carried on voices, fear tucked into pauses. The man grew thinner. His movements sharpened. When he did speak, it was with urgency that suggested time had begun to matter in ways it hadn't before. Eliza understood then that her disappearance was not an end state, it was a holding pattern. What unsettled her was not captivity. She had long since accepted that freedom, as defined by others, was not available to her. What unsettled her was the sense that she was being preserved, kept intact, protected not for who she was but for what she represented, or what she might be used to prevent. And yet, even here, even now, she remained unclaimed in the ways that mattered. No one touched her, no one punished her, no one attempted to extract obedience through pain. This absence of violence was not kindness, it was calculation. Pain, after all, makes people unpredictable, and unpredictability was the one thing her owner could not afford. Months passed, then longer. Eliza aged invisibly, her existence folded into a place the city did not record. If someone searched for her name, they would find nothing beyond the first auction. The second did not exist, the townhouse did not exist, the house she lived in did not exist in any ledger she could imagine. She had become a gap, and gaps invite speculation. Years later, how many she could not say, letters began to arrive without seals, no sender, no formal greeting. They were delivered by different hands at different times, always when the man was away. The first was left on her table as if it had always belonged there. She did not open it immediately. She studied the paper. The weight, the ink, the hand was educated, disciplined, but careful not to reveal too much. Whoever wrote it understood the value of anonymity. When she finally read it, the words were simple. They are asking questions that will not help them. Eliza folded the letter and placed it beneath the others that would come later. The second letter asked for advice without admitting it was advice being sought. The third described a situation with enough detail to suggest urgency, but not enough to confirm truth. Eliza answered none of them directly. Instead, she wrote responses that clarified consequences. She did not instruct. She illuminated. Her replies left the house the same way the letters had arrived, quietly, inconsistently, untraceably. She had become something new, not a slave, not a free woman, a node. Information flowed toward her, paused, then flowed outward, changed. Not because she commanded it to, but because people needed her to make sense of what they were facing. They did not come to her for hope. They came to her for certainty, or as close to it as could be tolerated. Each letter ended with the same line, written in a hand that was always hers, though the ink varied. Freedom is not given. It is remembered. She did not know why she wrote it at first, only that it felt necessary. Over time, she realized it was not a message to others. It was a reminder to herself. The man who owned the house discovered the letters eventually, not all at once, one at a time. He confronted her only after he understood that stopping them would be costly. "You are becoming visible again," he said. Eliza met his gaze. "I never stopped being visible," she replied. "You stopped looking." He considered that, then asked the question he had avoided for years. "What are you?" Eliza thought carefully before answering. "I am someone you could not afford to lose," she said, "and someone you could not afford to keep." He laughed once, sharply. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." After that, his visits grew less frequent. When he did appear, it was with the air of someone saying goodbye without admitting it. He asked fewer questions. He stopped reading letters aloud. The house began to empty, not suddenly, but deliberately. Furniture removed, rooms closed, staff dismissed. Eliza understood what was happening before the final confirmation arrived. One morning, she woke to find the house silent. No footsteps, no deliveries, no voices. The door to the courtyard was unlocked. On the table lay a single document. Not a manumission, not a confession, just a statement, unsigned, acknowledging that the house and its contents had been transferred to a trust that did not name beneficiaries. She read it once, then she left. No one recorded her departure. No one noted the time. No one asked where she went. By the time the house was discovered empty, Eliza had already become something else, an absence moving through spaces that could not hold her. Later, historians would search for her and find nothing. No death record, no escape notice, no account of resale. They would argue about whether she had ever existed at all. Some would call her a myth, a composite, a rumor inflated by time. They would be wrong. Eliza had not disappeared. She had simply stepped outside the story history knew how to tell, and that, perhaps, was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. When Eliza stepped out of the house and into a city that no longer knew her name, she did not experience it as freedom. Freedom, as it was commonly imagined, required recognition, papers, witnesses, permission to exist. What she stepped into was something quieter and far more precarious, anonymity without protection. New Orleans had not opened its arms to her. It had simply failed to notice her, and invisibility, she understood, could be either a shield or a sentence depending on how it was worn. She moved carefully at first, not because she feared capture, but because she understood how patterns foe. People who disappear loudly are hunted. People who disappear gently are forgotten. Eliza chose gentleness. She took rooms that did not ask questions. She stayed long enough to be remembered vaguely, then left before memory could sharpen into curiosity. She changed nothing about herself except location, and that constancy made her harder to track than any disguise. It was during this period, unrecorded, undocumented, almost certainly intentional, that the impossible secret began to take shape. Those who encountered her now did not know her history. They did not know she had once stood on auction blocks or been debated in rooms full of powerful men. To them, she was simply a woman who listened too closely and spoke too precisely. They did not seek her out because of rumors. They sought her out because something in her presence rearranged their thinking. She did not offer answers so much as perspective, and perspective, once altered, cannot be returned to its original shape. The secret was not that Eliza predicted events. That idea, repeated often enough, had become a convenient distraction. Prediction implies inevitability, a fixed future unfolding according to rules beyond human influence. Eliza did not believe in inevitability. She believed in consequence. The difference mattered. She understood systems. That was the secret. Not in the abstract sense taught in books, but in the lived sense, the way incentives bend behavior, the way fear narrows imagination, the way power relies on repetition to appear natural. She had grown up inside a machine designed to erase complexity and had survived by noticing its seams. Where others saw walls, she saw joints. Where others saw laws, she saw habits, and habits can be broken. What made her impossible was not intelligence alone. Many intelligent people lived and died inside that world without leaving a mark. What made her impossible was that she had never accepted the premise that the system was permanent. From an early age, how early, no one could say, she had treated it as temporary, flawed, improvable. That posture shaped everything she did. It allowed her to observe without internalizing, to comply without believing, to endure without surrendering. Most people living under oppression adapt by shrinking themselves. Eliza adapted by expanding her awareness. That awareness made her dangerous, because once someone sees a system clearly, they can begin to move through it without granting it authority over their inner life. And once that happens, control becomes performance rather than reality. Eliza had learned to play along without being convinced, and that distinction, the gap between behavior and belief, was where her power lived. She did not speak of this openly. She did not need to. Those who spent time with her felt it anyway. Conversations with Eliza had a way of shifting responsibility back onto the listener. She did not tell people what would happen. She asked what they were prepared to accept. She did not warn of disaster. She outlined choices and let silence do the rest. Some found this clarifying. Others found it intolerable, because the impossible secret cut both ways. If the system was not permanent, then neither were its protections. Those who benefited from it had just as much to lose as those trapped beneath it. Eliza did not threaten that loss. She simply refused to pretend it could not occur. In doing so, she destabilized the emotional contract that kept power comfortable. This was why those in authority had tried to erase her rather than destroy her. Killing her would have acknowledged her importance. Erasing her allowed them to pretend she had been an anomaly rather than a symptom. But erasure assumes stillness. It assumes the erased will not continue moving, thinking, connecting. They underestimated her. As Eliza moved through different cities, always briefly, always deliberately, she encountered others like herself, not identical, not aligned, but adjacent. People who had noticed the cracks. People who had learned to survive without internalizing the rules meant to confine them. These were not revolutionaries in the traditional sense. They did not meet in groups or draft manifestos. They recognized one another through conversation, through pauses, through the way certain questions were asked. Eliza never led them. She didn't have to. Her presence validated what they already suspected, that clarity was possible even in darkness, that awareness itself could be a form of resistance. She offered no instructions for rebellion. She offered something more durable, permission to trust one's own perception. That permission was contagious. Letters began to circulate again, though not in the same way as before. These were not requests for guidance. They were confirmations. Reports of actions taken, decisions altered, risks avoided. Eliza read them when they found her, then burned them. She did not collect evidence. She did not want proof. Proof attracts attention. Attention attracts force. The impossible secret required discretion. There were moments, of course, when the weight of it pressed against her, when she wondered whether clarity without action was enough, when she questioned whether refusing to claim authority was itself a kind of abdication. These doubts did not weaken her, they refined her. They kept her from becoming what the system would most easily recognize. A leader. Leaders can be targeted. Ideas are harder to pin down. Eliza chose to be an idea. This, more than anything else, explains why history failed to capture her. History is built around names, dates, positions of influence. It struggles with people who operate laterally, who affect outcomes without claiming credit. Eliza left no monuments. She signed no proclamations. She did not even insist on her own narrative. What she insisted on was understanding. The most unsettling aspect of the impossible secret, for those who came close enough to sense it, was that Eliza did not see herself as exceptional. She did not believe she possessed rare gifts or supernatural insight. She believed she had simply been forced to pay attention earlier and more thoroughly than most. The world had demanded it of her, and she had responded by sharpening her perception rather than dulling it. This belief made her both humble and unyielding. If her clarity was learned, then it could be learned by others. That implication terrified those invested in hierarchy. It suggested that the system's greatest strength, its claim to inevitability, was also its greatest weakness. If people stopped believing it was natural, stopped mistaking habit for law, the entire structure would have to justify itself anew, and justification is exhausting. There were attempts, of course, to locate her. Not publicly. Quiet inquiries. discreet questions asked in places where answers were usually bought. But Eliza had learned how attention moved, how it concentrated and dissipated. She positioned herself in its blind spots. She never stayed where interest lingered. She never corrected myths about herself. Let them grow strange, she thought. Let them become unusable. The impossible secret could survive only if it remained unclaimed. Over time, stories about Eliza diverged wildly. Some described her as a prophet, others as a ghost. A few dismissed her entirely as fiction. These contradictions protected her better than any disguise. A person with no agreed-upon shape is difficult to pursue. Belief fractured her image into pieces too small to grasp. Eliza aged, though not in ways easily measured. She marked time by shifts in conversation, by changes in what people feared, by the slow rearrangement of moral boundaries. She saw patterns repeat themselves, then fail. She saw systems adapt to survive, then overreach. She did not celebrate these moments. She noted them. Because the impossible secret was not hopeful, it was neutral. It did not promise justice. It did not guarantee improvement. It simply stated that nothing built by people is beyond change, and that change does not require permission to begin. This understanding stripped comfort from those who relied on stability and offered no guarantees to those who suffered. It demanded responsibility rather than faith. That demand was heavy. Not everyone who encountered Eliza was grateful. Some resented her for refusing to offer certainty where it could not exist. Some accused her of detachment, of watching rather than acting. She accepted these criticisms without defense. She knew that action without clarity creates different kinds of harm. She had seen enough of that. What she offered instead was orientation. And orientation, once gained, cannot be taken away. This was the true reason she had been erased. Not because she threatened individual men or fortunes, but because she undermined the psychological foundation of the system itself. She demonstrated, quietly, persistently, that the world could be read differently. That obedience was not the same as belief. That survival did not require surrender of perception. In a society built on enforced blindness, that was unforgivable. Eliza carried the impossible secret not as a weapon, but as a way of being. She did not announce it. She did not protect it jealously. She lived it, and in doing so she ensured that it would outlast her, passing invisibly from one mind to another, altering trajectories in ways no ledger could record. History would never know where she went or how she died, but history would feel her absence as a pressure, a question without an answer. A reminder that some forces move beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without ever asking to be named, and that perhaps the most dangerous knowledge of all is not how to overthrow a system, but how to see it clearly enough that it can no longer pretend to be eternal. Once the impossible secret began to move without her, Eliza became less a person than a disturbance in the fabric of things. Systems tolerate opposition when it is loud, emotional, and predictable. They know how to crush that. What they cannot tolerate is quiet clarity, the kind that spreads without permission, the kind that does not announce itself as resistance, the kind that teaches people to see before it teaches them to act. Eliza had done exactly that, and in doing so, she had crossed an invisible line. Not the line of rebellion, but the line of comprehension. From that moment on, it was never about punishing her. It was about containing the idea she represented. Those who had tried to erase her understood this instinctively. Power is rarely threatened by anger. Anger burns fast and consumes itself. But awareness endures. Awareness waits. Awareness adjusts. Eliza had become proof that awareness could survive even under conditions designed to extinguish it. That proof was intolerable. If one enslaved woman could live without internalizing the logic of her captivity, then captivity itself became less stable than it appeared. This was why they did not hunt her publicly. A public hunt would have given her shape again. It would have confirmed her importance. It would have asked the wrong question, where is she? The more dangerous question, the one they asked instead, was who else is like her? And that question had no satisfying answer. Silencing Eliza did not mean stopping her voice. She had never relied on speech. It meant dissolving the conditions under which her presence could be recognized as distinct. It meant ensuring that what she embodied would be dismissed as coincidence, superstition, or isolated anomaly. The goal was not to erase her entirely, that was impossible, but to fracture her meaning until it could no longer cohere into threat. This is how systems defend themselves when force fails. They rewrite context. They allow fragments of truth to exist, but remove the framework that gives them weight. They permit stories, but deny continuity. They tolerate rumors, but strip them of consequence. Over time, the absence of official acknowledgement corrodes memory. People begin to doubt their own recollections. What was once unsettling becomes unbelievable. What was once dangerous becomes folklore. Eliza understood this before it was done to her. That was why she never tried to correct the stories, never clarified, never insisted on accuracy. Precision would have given historians something to grasp. Vagueness protected her far better. By allowing herself to become inconsistent in the collective imagination, she ensured that no single narrative could be mobilized against her. But make no mistake, there were consequences. People who had been closest to her, who had benefited most directly from her clarity, began to withdraw, not out of betrayal, but fear. Proximity to Eliza had become a liability, not because she did harm, but because association with her invited scrutiny. Questions, patterns noticed too late. Some disappeared from her orbit deliberately. Others were pulled away by circumstances that felt accidental until viewed in hindsight. This isolation was intentional. Silencing does not always arrive as violence. Often it arrives as loneliness, as a gradual narrowing of contact, as the slow erosion of trust, until even those who believe begin to doubt the cost of believing publicly. Eliza felt this narrowing acutely, not as despair but as confirmation. The system was responding. That meant the pressure point was real. She adjusted accordingly. She became harder to locate, even to those who once knew where to look. She shortened her stays. She stopped answering certain kinds of letters, not because the questions had become dangerous, but because the answers would no longer travel safely. Silence once again became strategy. Those in power interpreted this retreat as success. They mistook absence for defeat. What they failed to understand was that Eliza had never been the source. She was a conduit. Silencing her physically or socially did not reclaim what she had already set in motion. The people she had affected did not revert to ignorance once she was gone. You cannot unsee a system once you've recognized it as constructed. You can choose not to act on that knowledge. You can bury it. But it remains. This lingering awareness was the real threat. Not uprising, not violence, but the quiet refusal to confuse authority with legitimacy. That refusal does not announce itself. It changes how people comply. It alters the tone of obedience. It introduces friction into processes that depend on smooth, unquestioned participation. Friction slows machines, and slow machines reveal their workings. Eliza had taught people, without ever saying so, that the system's greatest strength was not force, but belief. Belief that things had always been this way. Belief that resistance was futile. Belief that survival required internal agreement with one's own diminishment. Once that belief was weakened, even slightly, the system had to work harder to maintain itself. It had to rely more heavily on violence, which in turn exposed its instability. This feedback loop terrified those at the top, so they silenced her not because she was loud, but because she was subtle, not because she led others, but because she removed the psychological barriers that made leadership necessary. Not because she promised change, but because she demonstrated that change was already happening, whether acknowledged or not. There were moments, rare, unrecorded, when Eliza considered stepping forward again, claiming a name, anchoring the fragments of her story into something solid. But each time she recognized the trap. Visibility would turn her into a symbol. Symbols attract projection. Projection simplifies, and simplification would undo everything she had preserved. She did not want to be remembered as exceptional. She wanted the idea that she embodied to feel ordinary. That goal required her continued absence. Silence in this sense was not surrender. It was fidelity to the understanding that lasting transformation rarely comes from confrontation alone. It comes from shifts in perception that accumulate quietly until the old explanations no longer suffice. The system sensed this shift. even if it could not name it. It responded the only way it knew how, by tightening control in visible ways while ignoring the invisible ones. Laws grew harsher, surveillance increased, punishments escalated. These measures reassured those in power that they were still in command. They did not notice that these actions also confirmed the very instability Eliza had revealed. The more force required to maintain order, the less natural that order appeared. Eliza watched this from a distance, never staying long enough to be implicated, never withdrawing so completely as to lose touch. She measured progress not by victories, but by questions. When people began asking why instead of how, she knew the shift was continuing. She remained cautious, however. Awareness without care can turn into arrogance. She avoided those who sought her out as an oracle, who wanted certainty without responsibility. She refused to become a replacement authority. That too would have replicated the structure she sought to undermine. Her silence, therefore, was selective. She spoke when doing so would encourage discernment. She withdrew when speech would create dependency. This balance was difficult. It required constant attention. But Eliza had learned early that attention was the one resource no system could fully control. Over time, the efforts to silence her faded, not because they had succeeded, but because they had become unnecessary. The city moved on. New anxieties replaced old ones. Names changed. Boundaries shifted. Eliza's absence became complete enough that new generations never heard of her at all, and yet the pattern she had introduced remained. People who could not articulate why certain arrangements felt wrong. People who complied outwardly but withheld belief. People who noticed inconsistencies and did not rush to resolve them with comforting lies. These people did not know Eliza. They did not need to. They carried the afterimage of her clarity without ever seeing its source. This was the system's failure. It had silenced the woman, but not the way of seeing she represented. History would later search for a singular cause, a movement, a figure to explain the gradual unraveling of old certainties. It would find wars and laws and leaders and declare those the engines of change. But beneath all of that, unnoticed and uncredited, would be something quieter, the accumulated effect of people who had learned somehow not to mistake permanence for truth. Eliza had been one of the first to embody that understanding in a way others could feel. That was why they had to silence her, not because she broke the rules, but because she revealed that the rules were breakable. And once that realization takes root, no amount of silence can fully erase it. Long after Eliza had faded from memory as a person, she endured as a pressure, not a story passed down cleanly, not a name spoken with certainty, but a tension that surfaced whenever people confronted the limits of what they were told was possible. History likes clean endings, births and deaths, victories and defeats. Eliza offered none of that. What she left behind was not a conclusion, but an inheritance that could not be claimed, only felt. In the decades that followed, New Orleans changed faces many times. Flags shifted, laws were rewritten, slavery itself would eventually be declared over, though its logic lingered long after the chains were removed. New systems rose to replace old ones, each promising progress while preserving familiar hierarchies. To historians, these transitions would later appear driven by grand forces, wars, economics, political movements. But beneath those visible current, something quieter persisted, a subtle refusal among certain people to fully internalize the stories they were given. That refusal had no single origin, but Eliza had been one of its earliest, clearest expressions. People began to notice it without knowing what they were noticing. An enslaved man who learned to read and did not apologize for his intelligence. A woman who followed the rules without believing they defined her worth. A clerk who questioned why certain laws existed at all, instead of merely how to obey them. These were not rebels in the traditional sense. They did not organize. They did not declare war. They simply withheld something the system depended on, unquestioned belief. This withholding was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. That was its strength. Eliza's legacy lived in these small acts of internal separation, the ability to comply without surrendering one's inner autonomy, the capacity to observe power without mistaking it for truth. These skills were not taught in schools. They were learned through experience, through pattern recognition, through paying attention to contradictions that others learned to ignore. Over time, this way of seeing spread quietly. like a language learned without realizing one is studying it. Those who carried it often felt isolated. They struggled to articulate why certain explanations rang hollow, why official narratives felt incomplete, why authority, even when legally justified, sometimes felt morally thin. They were not always right. Eliza herself would have acknowledged that, but they were awake. And wakefulness, once achieved, is difficult to undo. The system adapted, as systems do. It learned to tolerate a degree of skepticism, to market the appearance of choice, to absorb criticism without altering its core assumptions. It learned that total obedience was no longer necessary, partial compliance would suffice. But even this adaptation carried traces of Eliza's impact. The need to adapt implied vulnerability. The pretense of inevitability had cracked. Eliza did not live to see the long arc of these changes in any documented way. No diaries survive, no letters signed with her name, no grave marks her passing. If she lived to old age, she did so in obscurity. If she died young, it was without witness. History, faced with this absence, chose the easier explanation, that she had never mattered enough to record. But erasure is not evidence of insignificance. Often, it is evidence of discomfort, because Eliza represented something deeply unsettling to any system built on domination, the idea that clarity can exist without permission, that understanding does not require authorization, that even in the most restrictive conditions, the human mind retains the capacity to step back, to observe, to question. And once that capacity is exercised, it leaves traces. Those traces cannot be legislated away. They cannot be auctioned. They cannot be owned. Eliza's body had once been priced, debated, transferred. Her mind never was. That distinction mattered more than any legal status she held or lost. In refusing to collapse her inner life into the role assigned to her, she demonstrated a form of freedom that preceded and outlasted formal emancipation. This is the part history struggles with. Freedom, as recorded, is usually external. Documents, decrees, borders crossed. But Eliza's freedom was internal first. It manifested as orientation rather than escape. She did not begin by leaving her circumstances. She began by refusing to let them define reality for her. Everything else followed from that refusal. That is why her legacy could not be killed. It did not depend on her survival. It depended on her example, even when that example was unrecognized. When historians later asked why certain oppressive systems began to fail, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and unevenly, they pointed to material causes, economic inefficiencies, political pressure. More, awakening. All of these played roles, but none of them explain the quiet readiness among so many people to imagine alternatives. When the moment finally arrived, that readiness had been cultivated by people like Eliza, not alone, never alone, but early enough, clearly enough, that others could sense the possibility before it was named. She was not a hero in the traditional sense. She did not save masses. She did not lead revolutions. She did something subtler and, in many ways, more enduring. She modeled a way of existing that made oppressive logic feel provisional rather than absolute. She lived as though the world could be read critically, even when it could not yet be changed. And reading the world differently is often the first step toward remaking it. The tragedy and the triumph of Eliza's story is that it resists closure. There is no final scene where justice is delivered or wrongs are publicly righted. There is only continuation, influence without acknowledgement, change without attribution. A life that mattered precisely because it did not ask to be remembered. Yet here we are, speaking of her now, not because history preserved her, but because something in her story continues to resonate. The idea that the most dangerous resistance is not always loud, that survival can be intellectual as well as physical, that systems endure not just through force but through convincing people that no alternative way of seeing exists. Eliza proved that this conviction was false. She did not shout it. She lived it. And that is why, even now, even at a distance of centuries, her presence can still be felt in the discomfort people experience when confronting unjust structures, in the pause before accepting an explanation that feels too neat, in the quiet recognition that what is presented as permanent may in fact be fragile. This is the legacy they could not kill. Not a woman, not a name, but a way of seeing that slips through cracks, survives erasure, and reappears wherever people begin to suspect that the darkness they were born into is not the whole story. If this story stayed with you, it made you pause, if it unsettled you in a way you didn't expect, make sure you subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment below telling us how interesting this story was for you. Because some histories aren't meant to comfort, they're meant to wake you up.